and welcome to So Easy. Thank you for joining me today when we sew our roundabout bag. Let's just have a quick look at the bag already. As you can see, it's round, it has a side gusset. We have an optional twist lock opening with a pocket on the front, and on the other side I've just split the pocket in half in two with some dividing stitching. So this is optional. You can do one pocket complete without any stitching, one with stitching, split it exactly how you like. We've got ready-made leather handles, and then up on the top we have our zipper opening with the lining inside. I'm going to just make mine with the one pocket, but you can add whatever pockets you like to your lining. It's also got obviously the piping around the outside, and again the piping is optional. You can make the bag completely nicely without the piping, but I think it adds a nice little touch. So let's get started with the materials that we need. So these are our materials. I've got two fabrics. I've used two fabrics in my original bag here. We'll call this one the main fabric and this one is the contrast. You'll also need a fabric for your lining. Then you'll need some ready-made handles. If you prefer, of course, you can make your own fabric handles and attach those, but I really like the look of the leather ones. If you are using these with the sew-on holes just here, then you'll need some matching embroidery floss to attach your handles. You'll also need a zipper, which matches the top fabric of the bag, and that is 12 inches or longer. If you're using a small twist lock on the front like I am, then you'll probably want to use some Fray check. For adding in the zipper, some basting tape or wonder tape is really useful, and then either some ready-made piping or make your own. Then of course you'll also need interfacing. I'm using ShapeFlex SF101, also a flex foam and some fusible fleece. So first we need to use our full circular pattern piece to cut some fabric. I've got two pieces here of lining, two pieces here of the contrast fabric. That's going to be this panel here on our bag, and also one more of the lining, which is going to form my pocket. So you can do one, two pockets, no pockets, entirely up to you. The two main lining pieces, those have the ShapeFlex on the back, as do these two main pieces for the outer contrast part of the bag. We can set all of the lining pieces aside, we don't need those for now. And next we need to just trim our pattern. So here on the pattern we have a trim line, this dark line just here, not the dotted line, the solid line, and we need to just cut the pattern at that point. Put this piece aside, you'll be needing that later. And now this one will be used to create the pocket on the front of the bag. So this piece here is going to be used to cut that part there. So you'll need to cut 4 pieces of your main outer fabric and then interface them with your ShapeFlex, and then we'll go on to sew more for the pocket. So using this piece, I've now cut out and interfaced 4 of the pocket pieces. So let's just work on 2 of them. I'm going to place them right sides together, and around this curve here just add a few clips or pins, and you're going to sew around this curve. So here between these 2 points, so from here to here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then do the same on this other set. So here's my 2 pocket pieces sewn, and as you can see around the top of the curve just here I've notched into the seam allowances, and this, when we turn it the right way, will help those seams sit nice and flat. Now if we go back to our pocket piece where we have the dotted line just here, we're now going to trim off the seam allowances from this because we need to use this as a template to cut some fleece. So I'm just going to go around here, cut off the dotted line for those seam allowances, and then I'm going to use the smaller template to cut myself 2 pieces of fusible fleece. So here's my piece of fleece, and what you need to do is take a look at your pocket and decide if you have one that you want to be the outside and one that you want to be the lining. For my fabric it doesn't really matter, but if you have one with a larger design which you've put on the front of your pocket there, then if this is the front, you're going to fuse the fusible piece to fleece to what will be the outside. So if you just match it pretty central, just a little fraction there away from the stitching line, and fuse that in place to what will be the outside of your pocket, and then just fold it over, give it a good press, and it'll look like this. And you do end up with some little bits just sticking out there, which is your seam allowance, and you can just trim those off. Now if you want to, if you like the look, you can do some top stitching along the edge of this curve here, but that is optional. So now repeat and do the same for both of your pocket pieces. If you've decided that you would like to add a twist lock to the front of one of your bag or both pockets, then it's time to do that now. So I've just folded my pocket in half and found where the centre is, and I'm going to put my lock about there, depending on the size of your lock, what style it is, you know, where you want it. So placement is pretty much up to you, so long as it's central. So I'm just going to use a fabric marker and a little back plate there to mark what I need to cut, and then I'm going to start out with my seam ripper and finish off with just a pair of sharp scissors and make a little cut through both layers in order that I can install that snap. So my lock is now in. I did add some of this Fray check around the front and the back of that little hole, just to make sure that things weren't going to come undone, and do make sure that you screw those screws nice and tight so that it gets a really good grip on the fabric. So now it's time for us to add the pocket onto the front of our bag. So you just need to line up at the bottom like that. It's pretty straightforward. Obviously if you have a directional print on the contrast piece here, make sure that that's facing upwards. I'm just going to add a few clips around the outside, and then I'm just going to baste the pocket in place, so just around the outside here, not at the top obviously because this is our open part, and then I'll baste the pocket to the back panel. Now you can use your circular piece as a template, pop that down on top of your flex foam and cut around it, and do that for both pieces, and then take them over to the sewing machine and baste. I like to just use a zigzag stitch around the edge of mine, make sure I catch everything, and remember you've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance, so you've got plenty of room for your basting. So baste those two in place now. So everything's basted and it's time to finish up on the pockets. On this one, rather like the first bag I showed you, I'm just going to do a central line of stitching down here to divide this into 2 smaller pockets, but you can just leave it as 1 pocket if you like to. On this side we need to just insert the other part of our twist lock. So you can open up the little prongs there, put the lock through the front and clip it, and then you can see where the prongs fall on the inside of your bag. Just give it a little press so you can see the prongs and make the appropriate hole and fit the other half of the twist lock. When you do that, you'll have prongs coming through on the back here, so I suggest just fusing a piece of fusible foam, fusible fleece over the top of those prongs, just so that you won't be able to feel them through to your lining. Now it's time to sew on our handles. As you can see, I've got these which have got the kind of oval shape at the bottom and the little hinges, and your pattern piece here has a suggested handle placement, so if you just pop that on there, then you can see more or less where probably your handles should go, and see if that looks right for you. But of course it depends on the style of your handles, so long as you have them so that they're not within the seam allowance, not too far down towards the pocket just here, and they're central either side, that wherever you decide to put them is going to be good. So with these ones you can either sew them on by machine, or I like to use the embroidery floss, so I've done that on the first ones. Let me pull them over. You can see just here I've sewn them on with the embroidery floss, but you can do it by machine too. If you set your machine to the right stitch length, you can also do that. So if you stitch your handles on now, and obviously make sure that the placement on the second piece is exactly the same as the first, so that the handles will be the same length. So the handles are sewn, the front and back of my bag is finished. I'm just going to put that to one side, because now we're going to start on working on the gusset of the bag. First thing we're going to do is make these little zipper pulls just here. They just make it easier for you to zip and unzip the bag, having these little pulls on there, so I suggest you add them. You need to cut yourself a piece 4 inches by 6 inches. And this is constructed exactly the same as you make a regular fabric bag handle. You fold the fabric in half, then fold the raw edges in towards that centre, and then fold it into quarters so that all the raw edges are tucked in the middle. And then if you take it over to the sewing machine and just stitch 1/8 of an inch close to this edge and close to this edge, and then cut it in half so that you'll have 2 3-inch long pieces. It's time now to create the bottom gusset of the bag. So that's this part of the bag here that goes from the zipper down, and it's going to be very simple to get this ready. You need to cut a piece of fabric which is 4 inches wide by 19 1/4 long. Add your ShapeFlex interfacing to the back. Cut a piece of foam which is exactly the same size, and then just baste them together around the outside. Now when you So time now to work on the top zipper gusset. This is the section here, these 2 pieces that have the zipper in between on the top of the bag, and you need to cut 2 pieces of fabric which are 2.5 inches wide by 11 inches long, and then cut 2 pieces of interfacing which are slightly smaller, 2 inches wide by 10 inches long, and apply the interfacing as you see here. When you're thinking about placement, these edges without the interfacing, these are going to join in the center like this for our zip, so our zip will be in between and these will be joining. So now we need to sew them together, right sides together, and we'll pop them like that so that the 2 sides without the interfacing are together. And we're just going to baste them because we need to remove these stitches later on. So baste along this length without the interfacing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and just use a long basting stitch which you can remove later. Once you have your piece sewn, press this seam allowance open on the back so that it's nice and flat, and then you'll need 2 pieces of fusible fleece. These are 1.5 wide by 11 inches long, and you slide these up in under that seam allowance there, all the way on either side, obviously with the fusible side down, same on this other side, right up to the stitching line just there, and then fuse those 2 pieces of fleece in place. The fabric here is 11 inches, so it will be really useful, make it easier to use a zipper which is longer than that. So as you can see, mine is longer than my piece of fabric. And I've added some basting tape. This is Wonder tape. I use it a lot with zippers because I find it easier than pinning. So you can also use a glue stick or some kind of double-sided tape, whichever you like. So add that down the sides of your zipper. I'm just going to peel the paper away now to reveal our sticky side. Okay, there's my sticky. So now we need to place the zipper down so that the coils of the zipper are directly over this seam line that we've just sewn. So we just lie it down like that, start up at one point, and as I lie it down I just check that the teeth are lining up with that seam, and I'll press into it with my fingers, and that holds that basting tape in place, checking those teeth are in line all the way down. Good thing with the tape, it helps the zipper lay nice and flat, much better than with pins, and it's obviously easier to reposition it too, so I can just pick up, carry on going all the way down to the bottom, making sure those teeth line up with that seam, and then give it a good press to make sure it's in there securely. Now I'll take this over to the sewing machine. I'm actually going to use my regular foot, not a zipper foot, because I don't want to be right up close to the teeth of the zip. I want to be about 1/4 of an inch away and just catch the back of the zip as I sew. So take this over now, secure the zip in place with a line of stitching down both sides. So now the zip's in place, and as you can see it's just caught the edge of the tape there on the back with the stitching. So now it's time to undo our basting stitches. So time for a bit of fun seam ripping. Get your seam ripper in there and undo the basting stitches. Pull out all the little bits of thread all the way along. Now it's time to trim the zipper and add in our little zipper pulls. However, something very important, do not cut off your zipper pull. You'll feel really silly and have to do the whole thing again. So undo your zipper just a little bit, and then you can cut off this end, that's not a problem. And now you can cut off these extra tails up here. So obviously make sure that you don't cut your zipper pull off. Now it's time to take the little zipper pieces, the pulls that we created earlier, fold them in half and line those up so that they're pretty central here, and pin or clip those in place. Same up at this end. If you have a favourite side, pick your favourite side, and then we're going to do it. Pull these ends in together, add the zipper pull just there in the centre and clip it. And now you baste these two in place. So I'm going to use a zigzag stitch and just baste those, make sure it's square so that they look good once the bag is sewn. Now it's time to complete our gusset into the round circle, which is going to create the bag shape for us. So if you match the two right sides together, put a few clips just here, and then obviously on this other side scrunch that up so that they match. A few clips here, and I'm going to sew that right sides together, and again use a 1/2 inch seam allowance on both of these two seams. Now let's have a look at this seam that we've just sewn here. These seams are pretty bulky, there's quite a lot of layers there. So if we take a look, you have this part which has the zipper and then the under part which has the foam. So I'm just going to ask you to trim that lower section. So you're going to remove some of that foam from the seam like that, and then fold the top section down towards the bottom gusset. So if you have a look, you've got the zipper here and you're going to fold the whole lot down. Do the same on this other side too, and then while holding the seam down, just top stitch along here underneath this seam here so that it's going to hold those layers nicely in place. Adding piping to the outside of your bag is an optional step. You don't need to, but I think it looks nice. So you'll need about 2 yards of piping. A contrast colour looks nice, so I'm using the black, the same as I've got here, and matching my handles. So there's separate tutorials on the So Easy site about how to make bias tape and also how to make piping. So I'll put links to those and you can refer to those if you need a little bit of a reminder. So I'm going to start at the centre bottom and leave myself plenty of fabric left over here for joining, and then I just normally like to start with a few clips, and once it gets going I'll just feed it round all the way until I come back and then join the piping and the cording down at the bottom. So once I've done one side, then bring over the other side of my bag and put the piping around this side too. Once the piping is on, it's now time to join the main outer panel to our gusset panel. So if you fold your gusset panel in half, matching up seams, and then mark pin at the centre top and the centre bottom. Oh, I'm missing a pin just there. Let me replace that one. And then we need to join our gusset panel with our outer panel, of course, right sides together. So if you take your, so let's start up at the top, fold the handle down out of the way. And I've got my centre top marked on the bag here and my centre part of the gusset, so I can just pin those two together. same down at the bottom. Got my bottom centre mark here and my pin there in the gusset panel. So I need to make sure that the seam allowance on the piping lies flat. Add a clip, and now we just need to clip or pin each side between these two. Now a word about ease, because our panel here, our gusset panel, needs to match on the stitching line, which isn't necessarily the same as the outer line, because of course when we work towards the center of our stitching line is a ½ inch in from the edge of this circle, then the outside is larger than the inside, of course. So you may find that the gusset is a little bit of a tight fit. You should be able to ease it in just fine, but if necessary you can add just a few little snips along the edge of the gusset to make it sit a little easier, but it should have enough in it that you can get it to match up quite nicely. So I'm going to start clipping mine in place, and when we sew, we want to sew with the circular part on the bottom. So if you put your pins or clips in, make sure that you bear that in mind, that we're going to sew it with the circular side down, and add plenty of clips and pins, because obviously you are trying to join something which is straight to something which is circular. So you want to try and make it as easy on yourself as possible. Make sure that the flat part of the piping, the seam allowance for the piping there, lies flat, so that that's not going to get caught or distorted. And it looks like my first half is matching nicely, so I'm going to carry on clipping mine now so that I've got it clipped all the way around. So my piece is now clipped all the way around, it eased in just fine. So now time to take it over to the sewing machine, and as you sew, you'll sew in small flat sections. So sew from here, move it around a little bit, sew from here, and you can feel the edge of the piping here. So use your zipper foot and try and sew nice and close up tight to the edge of that piping, and then when you turn it out you get a nice neat finish. So I'm going to do that now, and let's see how I get on, and then it'll be time to do the other side. So once you've sewn round, just turn your bag right side out and check around your piping. Have you got in close enough anywhere, or is there any little spots where you have a little gap where you weren't quite close enough to your piping? Then you can go back now and correct that. Assuming you're happy, it's time for us to continue with the other side. So pop the bag inside out again. And now it's time to do exactly the same on the other side. So let me get my other piece over and we can clip into the other side of this gusset part. So the other side of my bag is ready. Don't duck too closely at my piping. I swear that bias tape and curves, really the two of us, we don't get along very well. Okay, so let's take a look. We've got the top and the bottom center marked, and one important thing to do now is to undo that zipper so that we'll be able to get inside of our bag once we've got everything sewn. Again, hold the handle out of the way, and then I'm going to match the center top up here and put in my first clip. Match the center bottom down here. That's there. Add in my first clip. Now you should, if you want, be able to take the handles up now and out through the zipper panel up at the top, and that might make it a little bit easier for you. It depends on your handles and whatever, to just see what works better for you. And then, same as we did before, we're just going to make sure that those seam allowances from the piping lie flat and clip the bag all the way around, and then sew exactly the same as we did for the first side. Remember again that we're going to sew with the circular part on the bed of the machine, so the circular part will be down. So when you're pinning or clipping, just bear that in mind. So I'm going to carry on now pinning round, and then we'll stitch and see how it's come out. So once you've sewn your bag and the outer is all complete, turn it right side out and just double check all of your seams. Make sure you've got up nice and close to your piping. When you're happy that everything is good, we just need to trim down these seam allowances. So we've got a 1/2 inch seam allowance here and it's quite thick and bulky. We're going to feel that through our lining. So we're just going to trim these down by about half. So go all the way around. You should be able to do it from the circle side up and keep that seam allowance nice and flat as you go all the way around. So I'm just going to reduce mine down by about half. Obviously make sure that you don't make a mistake and cut through your bag or cut one of your handles off or goodness knows what else after all your hard work. But I think I'm doing okay. And then once we get round to the other side, we want to actually leave the bag as it is. So don't turn it right side out. Once your seam allowances are trimmed, you're going to leave it wrong side out like this. And now it's time for us to work on our lining. So we have our lining panels from earlier. We've got the 2 central lining panels which have got the interfacing, and there was one more. If you decided to cut the half pocket, then we've got one more circle which didn't have interfacing, and for this one you just fold the circle in half and top stitch along the edge, and it's going to create a little pocket for you. And now, obviously bearing in mind the orientation of your fabric, if you've got a directional print, you just add that to the bottom just here and baste the pocket in place, and then you can decide what divisions you want. I always like to have a pen in my pockets. I'm going to do one narrow one for a pen and then one here for my phone, and probably, you know, not much on the sides just here. So I'll decide how I'm going to split mine and just use an erasable fabric marker, draw some lines and then follow those with the stitching to create the pockets. So I'll go and do that now and then we'll take a look at it. So that's my simple pocket piece created in my lining. If you want to, you can go on to add you know, just a regular rectangular slit pocket, or if you want to, even a zipper pocket on the inside of your lining. And there are tutorials for both of those on the So Easy site, so if you check back to your written instructions, there will be links there to how you can go on to make other types of pockets if you want to. So now time to work on our zipper panels at the top, and these are going to be similar to the ones that you did for the outside of the bag. So you'll cut your pieces 2.5 inches wide by 11 inches long and cut both of them. This time, however, you're going to cut your interfacing slightly narrower. So where we cut it 2 inches before, this time you'll cut it at 1 3/4 inches wide by 11 inches. Fold, press it to the back of your panel and then fold over 3/4 of an inch. So on both sides you'll have folded over a 3/4 of an inch here at the center. Remember what I said again about if you do want to match, I mean you probably don't with your lining because no one's going to be able to see anyway, but it's always the folded edge which will come together on the inside. Once you've folded over your 3/4 of an inch, just top stitch. I've done this side already at about 1/4 of an inch from the folded edge, and do that on both of your lining zipper panels. Now we're going to create the central gusset panel for the bag lining. So you cut a piece for the bottom gusset, which is the same as before, 19 1/4 long by 4 inches wide, and put your ShapeFlex interfacing on the reverse of that one. And then we're going to take our zipper panel pieces and line them up at one end and also match the raw edges with the outside so that our folds are towards the center, and we'll end up with a gap there in the middle. I get a couple of clips. I'm just going to clip those in place. Same on this other side. I'll take those over here. Line up raw edges at the corners and leave a gap in the center. And then I'll take this over to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch. Actually, for our lining we're going to sew 5/8 of an inch because our lining needs to be slightly smaller so that it'll fit inside the bag, so we use a slightly smaller seam allowance. So with 5/8 of an inch I'll sew across here and then across here. Once the gusset piece is joined into a circle, the same as we did for the outer panel, We don't need to trim any seam allowances on the lining because it's already pretty fine, but we'll turn both seam allowances down towards the bottom gusset and away from the zipper panels up at the top, and then sew 1/4 inch from the original stitching line here, and that will hold both of those seam allowances neatly down in place. So do that for both sides and then just give them a nice press. Now it's time to fit the gusset piece to the round circular parts of the lining, and the same as we did before, I folded it in half and marked where my centre top and centre bottom are. Same with the circles for the lining, folded them in half to find centre top and centre bottom. And now we just match up and put the clips all around the same as we did before. There's my centre top, centre bottom, and then I can match up with the clips all the way around. So once I've got it clipped, I can sew, and I'm going to use a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to use a slightly larger seam allowance for the lining so that the lining sits nicely inside the bag without being too baggy. So I'll complete my first side and then we'll work again on the second. So I've got my first side sewn in, and I thought I'd show you that this is a really good example of the easing in that I've talked about before. So if you look all around the stitching line is flat and doesn't have any puckers and gathers, but around the outside you can see where it's all kind of wavy. So the stitching line matches, but the outer of the circle is larger than the outer circumference of the gusset. So that's why you need to ease the two in. Okay, so that's the first side completed. And now I'm going to take the other side of my lining panel and match that up. Again, centre top with the centre top of the zipper just here, centre bottom, and I'll pin and sew those two together. Again, I'm going to use a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to match these two pieces. So that's it, both sides of the lining sewn together. So our lining and the pockets and everything is now complete. And the same as we did before, I'm just going to trim down these seam allowances. I do like to use larger seam allowances when sewing the bags because it gives you just a little bit of wiggle room, and I think it's easier to work with. But then of course you can trim them down afterwards, and so then you can have the benefit of, you know, small seam allowances but large ones while you're working. If you're a quilter, you might find a 1/4 inch seam allowance easy enough to work with, but I still prefer to use a larger one. And then if things are a little bit out of shape, or while I've pressed things I've distorted it a little bit, or cut something not quite square, having the larger seam allowance just gives me the room to be able to correct that a little bit, which when you've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance, then you only have to be 1/8 of an inch out, and suddenly you've got 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So anyway, that's just me justifying my 1/2 inch seam allowances. I know some people think that it's a waste of fabric and we should have small seam allowances, but up to you. So I'm nearly done. I'm going to finish trimming this off, and then it'll be time to attach the lining to the outer of our bag. So now we're ready to attach the lining to the outer. As you can see, the outer of the bag is right side in and the lining is right side out. This is called a drop-in lining, and it's completed separately to the bag itself and then added to the bag later. Some people prefer it. I think in this kind of instance it's the best way to have added a lining to this bag. Now as you can see, the bag looks larger than the lining, so we're going to have to squish it down just a little bit. So I'm going to squish it a little bit to pop it down inside the lining, and as I'm doing this I'm double checking. Yes, we've got wrong sides together, so the wrong side of the bag is facing the wrong side of the lining, and that's exactly how we want it to be. I've got my zipper open, and now what we need to do is just match the bag with the lining around the zipper opening. So it'll take a little bit of squishing because obviously the outer is that little bit bigger, but start down here where you can see the zip, and we should be able to start pinning from there. Might take a little bit of fussing until you've got it exactly where you want it, and then we're going to pin the lining in place all the way around the bag. So I'll start over on this side too. Straighten and square everything up. That's going to come here. And the lining clips there. As you can see, the gap in the lining on the inside is a little bit larger than the zipper width that we had on the outside. So it means that we've got the lining held well back from the zip and it's not going to get caught as we're using the bag. Once you've got it started, it's going to lie pretty nice and flat and it's easy from then on. There we go. You can just clip that in place. Now I know some people like to then wrangle that under their machine, turn it the right way and re-stitch along the original zipper line, and if you like to do that, by all means go ahead and do it. I find that a little bit awkward with my machine. It doesn't have much space, so I actually prefer to hand sew. So once I've got these clipped in place, then I'm going to take a needle and thread and just slip stitch the edge of the lining here to the zipper tape. I don't want to stick my needle all the way through because I don't want my stitches to show on the outside. So I'm just going to do my needle at an angle and just catch the edge of the fold here of the lining fabric, catch the zipper tape and sew the two all together. Now I've got one little tip also for how to prevent baggy linings up at the top here, because at the moment it's only going to be attached to the zipper and it won't be attached anywhere else. But what you can do is before you attach it to the zipper, if you turn inside out, you have your two seam allowances here. So you've got the seam allowance for the bag and the seam allowance for the lining, and you can actually sew those together just in a couple of places, maybe somewhere in the middle, somewhere here and here. And if you just baste those together a little bit before you start, it can prevent your lining dropping down later on when you use it. But that's optional. You don't have to do that. You can just sew around the zipper if you want to. So I'm going to go and get myself a cup of tea and just sit down on the sofa, carefully hand sew this closed around the zipper. Looks a bit scary now, like teeth coming out of there. And then we'll come back, turn the bag the right side out and see what it looks like. So I've completed my bit of hand stitching now around the zipper opening just here, and even though I've used a white thread, the stitches are pretty much invisible really, so it's a nice way to finish off the bag. So now I'm going to turn it inside out and let's take a look at our finished product. So here we go, my roundabout bag is completed. I really like the shape of this one. It's something a little bit unusual, but the piping really brings that out as well. I only wish my piping skills were a little bit better. I'm sure yours are, and you can do a much nicer job than mine. So thank you very much for following along with this tutorial for the roundabout bag. I've enjoyed sewing it, both of them in fact. Remember we had our first bag that we've got here too. So I hope to see you over at Sew So Easy and that you'll work with me on some more sewing patterns one day soon. Thanks for watching.